You know, a lot of people have said to me since 9/11, Islam, wow, that's a really angry religion. And my answer is, I don't think so. I do think, though, that there are a lot of Muslims who are angry. Because as a faith community, they live in some of the most repressive, autocratic, women-unfriendly countries on the face of the earth. So it doesn't surprise me that a lot of them are angry. And I think religion, in some ways, is a mirror on your daily life and how you feel. Now, the question is, why do they have these repressive regimes? Well, I would argue it's a confluence of two factors, our interests and oil. The Arab world is cursed by oil.
Around the early 1970s, oil becomes the liquid gold. All of a sudden, you don't need to modernize your society. All you have to do is drill a hole in the ground, get the oil out and sell it. This makes for economic stagnation, but it also makes for political stagnation, because there's always money for the secret police, there's always money for the army, and there's money to bribe people into a certain kind of dependence.
We are familiar with the doctrine, no taxation without representation. What Muslims are learning painfully is that the converse is also true. Governments in receipt of oil revenues don't need to tax their subjects. They don't need to have representative assemblies to help them impose and collect the taxes.
Backed by their oil profits, Middle Eastern dictators have brutally suppressed all opposition, allying themselves with extremist clerics to consolidate their power and contain dissent.
Since the 1970s, Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing states have spent millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on trying to use Islam as a legitimizing tool. And this has done a great deal of damage to Arab society, because Saudi Arabia does not really want to invest in secular forces, in liberal forces. It has a particular vision, a particular agenda, a particular program. And Islamists basically fit that particular agenda, that particular vision.
I think it's an unholy alliance between oil and conservative ideologies. Those preachers, they can go into the mosque, preach whatever they want, tell whatever, extremist statements to their people they would like.
In Saudi Arabia, oil money has empowered an extremely intolerant version of Islam, Wahhabism, the chosen faith of the Saudi royal family. The Wahhabis believe that all reformers and modernizers are legitimate targets of violent jihad.
An inherent part of Wahhabism is to preach a jihadist philosophy. To even call it a philosophy is overly charitable, because it is a Spartan, very arid type of faith. You have your rules, they are cruel rules, you violate them, you're a dead woman, or you're a dead man.
Imagine that the Ku Klux Klan or some such organization manages to get control of all the oil of Texas and uses the proceeds of Texas oil to establish a network of well-endowed schools and colleges all over Christendom and beyond, peddling their very peculiar brand of Christianity. That would give you some equivalent, a rather pale equivalent, of what has happened in the Islamic world.
Over the last 3 decades, Wahhabi influence has extended well beyond the boundaries of Saudi Arabia through religious schools, charities, camps, and social organizations.
If you wanted money for an Islamic center in Indonesia, you got the money from the Saudi government or a Saudi charity, but it meant you had to either employ a Wahhabi preacher or accept the Wahhabi idea. And this has created a kind of globalization of Wahhabi Islam.
One result of the Wahhabi point of view is that it has resulted in a sense that, no, there's only one correct view. The other views are all heretical.
40 years ago, the Islam you would have seen around the world was an Islam that was very tolerant, capable of mixing with local cultures, tolerant of modernity, tolerant of the role of women in modern societies. And then you began to see the rise of this Wahhabi influence. people saying, no, you need something that's pure.
Osama bin Laden was raised within the Wahhabi doctrine. Some members of the Saudi royal family and Saudi charities allegedly fund Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and other terrorist organizations. And their clerics have reinterpreted the holy law of Islam, leading many Muslims to believe that terrorism is mandated by the Quran.
The holy law of Islam is clearly and strongly and overwhelmingly against suicide. It is a mortal sin for which there is no forgiveness. Even if a man has lived a life of unremitting virtue, if he kills himself, he forfeits paradise and goes straight to hell. Now the Wahhabis lay down that you may commit suicide provided you take a sufficient number of the infidels with you.
There are legitimate grievances. One can debate the importance of them, but there are legitimate grievances about the way in which the colonial powers handled the Middle East, the way in which the United States has handled the Middle East, the treatment of Israel and the Palestinians. But that is not a cause that drives people to take their own lives in acts of violent political extremism. Otherwise, you'd find places around the world where people disagree with American foreign policy. The Chinese, South Koreans, people in Africa, suddenly using terrorism as a means of expressing protests about foreign policy. It doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because the use of terrorism, and particularly the use of suicide bombing, grows out of a much larger culture of political extremism and violence. And that's what we really have to understand.